Hi, so today the social justice issue I'll be exploring is restorative justice and communication. The agenda is to introduce the topic of restorative justice, secondly, the failings of the criminal justice system, then we will introduce the three conversations framework and apply it to an episode of How to Get Away with Murder, and finally, we'll end with implications and conclusion. First, what is restorative justice? According to Sleva and colleagues, in an article from the Kansas Journal of Law and Public Policy, restorative justice is an approach that characterizes crime as an injury to people and communities and the aim of justice as healing. In the restorative justice lens, crime is not merely a legal construct, but a violation of people and relationships, which creates an obligation to make things right. In other words, it expands the stakeholders beyond the government and the offender to include the victims, community members impacted by the harm, such as family members of victims and offenders. The victim, offender, and the community cooperate in search of solutions which promote repair, reconciliation, and reassurance. According to McChargue and colleagues, professors from University of Nebraska and Florida Gulf Coast University, restorative justice is a concept that seeks to repair and reduce harm caused by criminal offending or wrongdoing. Restorative justice principles suggest that probation, imprisonment, and other typical reparations for criminal behavior are strengthened by holding the offender accountable while developing a better understanding of the implications of their crime on the victim, their family, and the community. Experts propose that this enhanced accountability decreases the likelihood of recidivism by focusing on the offender as a reintegrating member of society. Next, we come to question, how do restorative justice interventions work? According to McChargue and colleagues, traditional methods employ restorative justice interventions, or RJIs, through face-to-face mediation meetings between victim and the offender. The goal of these meetings is to repair the harm caused by criminal offending by primarily targeting the victim's perspective with focus on helping the victim benefit and heal from the process. Evidence supports the assumption that RJIs substantially reduce recidivism over a 12 to 18-month period following the intervention. Offenders who discuss a victim's perspective may develop empathy for the victim, and this empathy may alter future behavior. Empathy enhancement is the key mechanism in these interventions to enact change among offenders. RJIs offer an environment to enact this change. Next, this brings us to discuss the failing criminal justice system. According to a fact sheet from the Sentencing Project organization, the United States is the world's leader in incarceration. There are 2.2 million people in the nation's prisons and jails, which is a 500% increase over the last 40 years. Changes in policy and laws, not crime rates, explain this increase. A series of law enforcement and sentencing policy changes of the tough on crime era resulted in this dramatic growth in incarceration. Additionally, we have sent people to prison for much longer terms. Harsh sentencing laws, such as mandatory minimums, in combination with cutbacks in parole release, keep people in prison for much longer periods of time. The National Research Council reported that half of the 222% growth in the state prison population between 1980 to 2010 was due to increase of time served. Additionally, mass incarceration has not affected all communities equally at all. According to Allison Walsh of the Prison Policy Initiative, race is the defining characteristic of the criminal justice system. Blacks are much overrepresented in jails while whites are underrepresented in relation to the demographics of the overall population of the United States. For instance, whites hold 33.6% of the state and federal incarceration rates, blacks 35.4%, and Hispanics 21.6%. Yet, whites comprise 62.1% of the entire population, blacks 13.2%, and Hispanics 12.1%. Despite all of these extremes in terms of mass incarceration and the systemic racism, the harsh policies in place are still largely ineffective. Sleva and colleagues argue that punitive justice policies have neither significantly deterred crime nor increased satisfaction or well-being of crime victims and survivors. This is what brings us to restorative justice as an alternative to what former Attorney General Eric Holder called these draconian policies. Restorative justice as an alternative. According to Dr. Gregory Paul, professor at Kansas State University, restorative justice is typically utilized in nonviolent crimes by youth. However, they have been used in more serious crimes by adults, but not frequently. They may also be used as part of one's probation requirements. Additionally, victims are under no pressure at all to participate. Defendants may be under some pressure by the system to participate, but victims are doing this under their free will. Next, our thesis. Although restorative justice is gaining popularity as an alternative to traditional criminal justice procedures, the failings of the current system on American lives creates urgency to utilize this methodology and others in order to combat the biases inherent in our system. This brings us to the Difficult Conversations Guide from Stone, Patton, and Heen. The 3 Conversations of Conflict framework comes from this guide. It helps to clarify the structure of conflict by focusing on the stories people tell themselves and others. It's comprised of a series of questions about the self and the other in conflict. These conversations are marked by the what happened conversation, a conversation about feelings, and a conversation about identity. We will be applying this framework to an episode of How to Get Away with Murder. Here's a sneak peek at the episode to introduce somewhat the presence of the show and also what we will be discussing in terms of communication.
Did she specifically ask for us to come?
It's her first case back. Of course she wants you here.
So that's a no.
Stop worrying. It's going to be fine.
It never is when you say that.
Where's Wes?
I don't know. He didn't answer when I called.
You didn't knock on his door?
No, I didn't knock on his door. We were already late, and I didn't want to miss the showdown.
See? I'm not the only one who thinks she hates us.
She doesn't hate any of you.
Not even Laurel. She should. Enough. Just be nice when she gets here. But not too nice. You know she'll hate that.
Here she comes. She hates us.
Good. The feeling is mutual.
Why are they here?
To help on the case.
He's already pleaded guilty. What do I need help with?
You made it.
Of course I did.
I know, just you took it in the gut. That's a suffer shot. You really want to make them feel it.
Interesting, you should know that.
All right.
Be seated. This is a plea hearing for Jason Murray, charged for the second-degree murder of Tyler Robinson. It's my understanding that the prosecution and defense have already come to an agreement.
An agreement you need to refuse to accept, Your Honor?
If you're unfamiliar with How to Get Away with Murder, the show follows criminal defense attorney and law professor Annalise Keating and 5 of her students as they help with cases of hers alongside with her 2 employees, Frank and Bonnie. This episode in particular centers around the Keating Five's personal lives and the secrets that they share, as well as Professor Keating's current case, which, as you see, involving an accused murderer. During the pretrial hearing, proceedings are interrupted by a woman who turns out to be the victim's mother. She asks for the judge to be involved in restorative justice hearings with her, in which Keating and the district attorney vehemently oppose. She claims that she would push for a more lenient sentencing. Because of this, the judge relents and sides with the mother, despite Annalise and the DA's objections. We see the restorative justice meeting take place with both the defendant, the victim's mother, as well as legal counsel for both the defendant and the prosecutor's office. This brings us to the first of our 3 conversations, the what happened conversation. We ask of the defendant what were his intentions, what did he think were her intentions, and what did he contribute to the problem. For the victim's mother, we ask what was the impact on the defendant, what impact did the defendant have on her, and what did she contribute to the problem. What was interesting about this intervention in particular was that the defendant went in just wanting to apologize to the victim's mother. He wanted to express his remorse, but however, due to the heightened emotions of the intervention, he ended up confessing more than he had previously. His charges initially were for second-degree murder, but he confessed that he intended to shoot her son. It was premeditated. This was shocking to the victim's mother. However, she maintained her stance of empathy. She wanted to go in there. She wanted to understand him and understand his life. She wanted to know why this happened. She didn't want to come out in a place of hate. In terms of our second conversation, the feelings conversation for the defendant, we ask what feelings underlie his attributions, judgments. What does he need or want in order to feel differently in the future? For the victim's mother, we also ask of her story. What feelings underlie her attributions, judgments about the defendant? What information can she get or does she have about this question? What does she need to feel differently in the future? For the victim's mother, she discusses how she's never been so angry. She's been so angry at him, the system, the lawyers, even at God, she claims. However, she maintains a feeling of empathy for Jason's life, the defendant. He had his father in jail his entire life. He didn't have a mother around like her son did to support him. He was alone all of his childhood. For this, she blames the system that failed him, not him himself having the upbringing that she did. For the victim, he also displayed strong feelings in the conversation. He claimed that he felt weird when she asked for this meeting initially, but for the first time, he had hoped to be better. He felt that he could come out of this intervention as a better person than he was before. This brings us to the identity conversation. We ask, how has what happened affected the defendant's identity? How has what happened affected the defendant's sense of influence over the situation? What does the defendant need to restore his sense of identity? How has what happened affected the victim's mother's sense of identity? How has what happened affected her sense of influence over the situation? And what does she need to restore her sense of identity? Now, because of the revelations of the intervention, the prosecution attempted to raise his charges to first-degree murder. They were gunning for the death penalty. However, Annalise Keating and the judge came to the decision that that was unethical. What he said in the intervention was meant to be private. It was supposed to come to a place of agreement between the two parties. It wasn't meant to be used against him. Annalise advocated for the victim, for the defendant, and for restorative justice in general. She said that this would certainly muddy the entire premise of the intervention. People wouldn't be able to use that afterwards. And so the prosecution withdrew their goals to go for the death penalty, and they offered him a plea of life without parole. Jason accepted this life in prison. He claimed that he needed to pay for what I did to you. However, the victim's mother was upset by him accepting this plea deal when his initial deal was for 15 years. She claimed that I don't want an eye for an eye. Hate will destroy me. She wanted to see, good things come from this. She didn't want this to end in her being miserable her entire life. She wanted to have them help each other. And so because he was going to prison for so long, she approached him afterwards. She said she wanted to continue a relationship with him. She said, we're not giving up on each other. Like, there's more to come from this. There's more to come from both of them. Some takeaways from this episode in terms of restorative justice interventions. The show acknowledged that this was certainly an experimental context for restorative justice intervention. It was very extreme. It's not often used in real life scenarios. However, they also acknowledged the faults of the criminal justice system, and at least was successful in getting the prosecution to withdraw their attempt for the death sentence, because she said, stop blaming the defendants and start blaming the system that's failing them. Ultimately, the intervention didn't work out for how either party intended, but it also did a good job at conveying all perspectives of all sides, from the victim to the defender, the victim's family, the community, the prosecution's motives even. This brings us to communication strategies used in restorative justice. There are various methodologies used. First, we'll discover sequencing for emotional transformation. Dr. Jennifer Langdon, professor at Towson University, notes that this method for positive emotional transformation and community conferencing must follow a particular script. By this, she means that the 4 stages of this emotional transformation goes from anger / fear, contempt, to disgust or distress, surprise, then to deflation and collective vulnerability, and finally to interest and relief during the agreement stage. Additionally, we have other methodologies which emphasize strong community involvement and want to involve communities as much as possible during these justice hearings. Finally, this brings us to our conclusion. Both How to Get Away with Murder as well as the discussion of restorative justice interventions shows that the flaws inherent in the criminal justice system are not secret at all. Restorative justice attempts to find appropriate solutions to this problem and combat it at a systemic level and to make it more fair, because it currently clearly is not. Restorative justice is also more victim-centered. It opens new dialogues and is pushing towards empathy building. How to Get Away with Murder episode sheds lights on both the issues discussed and potential realities of this method of communication. Finally, this brings us to the works cited pages. Thank you so much for listening.